Hey, Kelsey.
Hey, Brooke.
Want to tell everyone what's happening in today's episode?
Today, we are going to talk about women who have been intentionally written out of history, and one of them was Alice Paul.
Okay. And how dare they?
How dare they?
Let's get into it.
Hello, and welcome to Remedial Herstory, the other 50%, the podcast that explores what happened to the women in history class. Now, here's your host, Kelsey Brooke Eckert, and her partner in crime, Brooke Neva Sullivan.
Episode 26, Getting Written Out, and Alice Paul. Brooke, this week, I got to sit down with the Tina Cassidy again.
Okay.
And she joined us when we talked about Jackie Onassis.
Yes, yeah.
So this
Great
week, she is back to talk with us about Alice
Tina!
Paul. Tina!
Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back.
Wow, I feel like you have a career in singing.
I mean, yeah, I'm leaving my current career and I'll be starting a YouTube channel. See you soon.
Woo!
You can see me with show tunes and wine. That'll be my channel. It'll be very Judy Garland-esque. Anyway, sorry, what are we talking about?
So, Tina Cassidy is an author. She is a chief marketing officer for organizations like PBS.
Okay.
And she is incredible. And so I'm going to play the clip that she shared introducing herself.
Hi, my name is Tina Cassidy, and I write about women and culture as sort of my side gig, if you will. It's what I do for fun and also for personal edification. And my day job, I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at WGBH Educational Foundation in Boston. We are the largest content creator for PBS, and we also own Boston's local NPR station. And prior to my current role, I worked in agencies, and before that, I was a journalist. I think I was probably 11 years old when I decided I wanted to be a writer. So really, storytelling has been the thread throughout all of the various aspects of my professional career.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. I didn't actually know that you had created content for PBS, so that's pretty cool. I just watched The Vote, the recent documentary that came out. That was so good.
Yes, I was happy to be in that as well. I can tell you a funny story, which was that I was interviewed to be in that documentary, and then a couple of weeks later, I got a phone call from GBH asking if I would interview for the role of Chief Marketing Officer. And American Experience, which created that documentary, is made at GBH. So of course I got the job, and they didn't know that I had been interviewed for the documentary. So it's just kind of funny position to be in way after the fact, to be promoting a film that I was in.
Yeah.
But it was great. It was really great. It's a well-made documentary.
So Tina's incredible.
Obviously.
And just such a wealth of knowledge about the women that she's written about, and just very passionate about getting women's history into the classroom.
Yeah, which, we're all here for. So thank you, Tina.
Yeah.
This is awesome.
So one thing that I really am curious about when it comes to specific women, like Alice Paul, Jackie O, is why are even some of these bigger name people not household names? So pop quiz, Brooke. Alice Paul.
No clue.
Great.
I know our audience is real surprised on that one. But who's Alice Paul?
So Alice...
Wait, can I guess?
Yes.
All right, let's do some context clues. Paul. I don't know any presidents, Paul.
Nope.
Don't know any generals.
She's an outlier.
Oh. Was she a Mrs. Paul?
Nope.
Damn.
Definitely not.
Well, Alice is a younger name. Gosh, I'm lost. When did she live? Who is she?
Okay.
Why don't I know her name?
You would recall her from our suffrage episode. So, Alice Paul is part of what I call a second wave of the suffrage movement.
Oh.
Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
First wave.
Sojourner Truth. Those women have passed away.
Right.
Okay, they pass away right at the turn of
Dead.
the century.
Gone.
Dead, gone. That
Done
sounds
amazing
really
things.
harsh. Okay, but those women are the role models for
Right.
a new, younger generation of women who are college educated.
Mm-hmm.
Alice Paul has multiple college degrees, including a
excuse me.
PhD. She studied at Oxford, just to be casual.
I'm sorry.
And while in Britain, she became involved in the British suffrage movement.
Okay.
And the British suffrage movement was
More violent.
more radical, and
Depicted in Mary Poppins poorly.
accurate. And so when she comes back, though, people are very wary of working with her. And
Oh, you remember this. So
does this sound familiar?
Yeah, because they were like, God, she's taken us to a whole new level
Right.
of like aggressive, go after it. But she just came back from the British suffrage movement, which like imprisoned women, made them actually starve to death in prison.
Yeah.
Like, well, they also chose and refused food
Right.
as part of their protest, which is fabulous.
Yeah. So
but
Paul takes
real
all
aggressive.
those tactics
Yeah.
and brings them to the United States. But she has to build a platform for herself first. So she gets connected with NASA, which is the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and they sort of reluctantly are like, okay, and they bring her on.
And they're a relatively moderate association. Like, weren't they trying to make change through policy?
They are trying to win suffrage state by state.
Right.
And they are petitioning, but they are very much trying to show that suffrage is practical, that suffrage is rational, and that they're not going to resort to those radical tactics that the British are using, because they didn't think that would work, and that would create bigger barriers to their cause.
Didn't it work?
So Alice Paul comes back, and she and her team, so they end up breaking away from NASA. There's a kind of a hostile relationship there. They get accused of violating fundraising guidelines and things like that.
Shocking.
And so she breaks ties with NASA, creates the National Women's Party, which becomes this more radical women's group, and they go, and their mission is national amendment, and we are going to change. We are going to
attack the amendment.
Yeah.
Okay. So wait, sorry, their acronym is NWP.
National Women's Party, and there is their building is actually near the U.S. Capitol where the NWP was. So it's right across the street actually. So I've gone and made my students take pictures there.
I'm so surprised, Kelsey. That sounds really unlike you.
Yeah, I know.
This is super Hey guys,
this is a random building with a plaque.
So weird. It's like, I don't know how we got here. Oh my gosh, it's NWP. Oh, that's so weird. I didn't know this was here. Oh my god, get my camera.
I got pause. So she basically is the radical group that gets the suffrage amendment finally passed. And it's not to discredit the other women from NASA and other groups, because they are like Carrie Chapman Catt, for example, Shaw, Ida B. Wells.
I mean, they moved many a roadblock.
Right. And I think every movement sort of needs the multiple like factions that are working toward.
You gotta
and
keep going.
She represents the more radical group. And so they are the ones.
You're down with NWP. Yeah, you know me. Sorry. Anyways.
So they're the ones that, when World War I breaks out, they are the ones outside the White House with the banners. The ones that when you think suffrage, you think
them.
NWP.
Yeah.
They're the ones holding signs that have phrases that Woodrow Wilson, who was the president at the time, said about fighting for democracy abroad. And they say, really, that's fascinating that you're going to go fight for Germany to have democracy. But you're not going to fight for democracy here. There's,
Snap.
yeah, they're
Make it a t-shirt.
feisty.
Make it a thing.
They end up getting arrested for blocking traffic.
Well, yeah, that's how you get noticed.
Right. The blocking traffic thing, though, was like obviously BS. And
correct.
So they go to prison, and they're in these workhouses. They start starving themselves, like refusing to eat.
I mean, sounds like it's gonna work.
Yeah, and it eventually does. And
don't they call it like? Don't they name that the nights that they got arrested something?
There's the Night of Terror because they were beaten in prison and handcuffed like with their hands above them where they're very uncomfortable. Their heads, women had their heads thrown against like cement walls and stuff. Like really, really terrible things happened.
This is what women did to get us the vote.
Yes,
just so you know.
But a lot of textbooks say things like they were given the vote. Like no, they
fucking took it.
So I'm summarizing all of this because we have talked about it before.
Yeah.
But I think she's sort of the end of these many decade.
Yes. She's the punctuation point
to it, and so Alice Paul was not a name that I learned in school. And I think I did learn the name Susan B. Anthony, the generation.
I definitely
before.
did, but I don't know if that's because I come from Connecticut or not.
Yeah. So both of those women are interesting to contrast Alice Paul, like remembering Alice Paul and Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony her friend wrote the book, The History of the Suffrage Movement, which sort of solidified her in our collective memory about women's suffrage, her and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And so, and it sort of raised the Seneca Falls Conference to maybe greater prominence. But Alice Paul, by contrast, was literally and intentionally written out of historical events and historical knowledge.
Is it because she was too radical?
It's because she was too radical. So I picked up with Tina Cassidy to talk about what Paul did after the 19th Amendment.
Cool.
This was not the end for her. So I asked...
I would imagine not. Someone with multiple degrees and willing to fight for just about any cause that had to do with helping women.
To starve herself.
Yeah. Get beaten up in prison. I imagine she was like, all right, now I can retire.
And now we're done. No.
And this is over.
Yeah. So this is what Tina Cassidy had to say about Paul getting written out of history.
Well, I would argue that even her work leading up to the 19th Amendment is not very well known. I think maybe in the centennial year that we're in right now, the centennial for the 19th Amendment, many people have learned about it, but I still think it's not popular American history, and it should be for something that important. I think the reasons why Alice Paul in general is not well known is because she was very humble. She was a Quaker for whom equality was rooted in her religious tradition, and this was not necessarily about politics. It was not necessarily about one issue, and for her, she was led by her vision for a more equal America. It was not about her and a crusade that she was on personally, and so she never put herself out there as someone who wanted attention as the leader. It was always about the issue. And she was a brilliant campaign strategist and so forth, and worked tirelessly behind the scenes, not just for the 19th Amendment, but for other issues that came after, which I'm happy to speak to in a moment. At the end of the 19th Amendment campaign, when the Secretary of State went to sign the amendment into law, making it part of the U.S. Constitution, he actively refused to let her in to be present, but he did allow other suffragists who were, let's say, better behaved into his office, and they were photographed as part of the signing ceremony. And so Alice Paul was quite literally cut out of the history that she helped create. So there was this whole myth making around, how the 19th Amendment passed, and she was not a part of that. The other piece is that those same group of the good suffragists, if you will, some of them went on to create the League of Women Voters, and they also wrote the history for the 19th Amendment and left Alice Paul out of it. So part of it was her own humility, and part of it was sort of an active effort to cut her out. because many believed she was too militant and, didn't play nice. She was impatient. And, even though it was a 70-year journey from Seneca Falls Convention, the first women's rights convention in America, to the passage of the 19th Amendment. So so after the 19th Amendment passes, 2 years later, she goes on to write the Equal Rights Amendment. And then, throughout the course of her career, she drafted or worked on many hundreds of pieces of legislation for women's rights in America, and also worked around the world after the Second World War for women's rights globally. So she did dedicate her entire life to the cause. It is worth noting, of course, the Equal Rights Amendment is not part of our Constitution now, although just in the last 18 months, the last 3 states have ratified the ERA, and there are many people who think that in the coming year, there could be some momentum in Congress that would help move it forward to ratify it finally. So who knows, we might be talking about Alice Paul again for very different reasons.
So
it's kind of like a Mean Girls group a little bit of like, we're cooler than you and we got this done and you didn't. But it's like they did it on her back.
Yeah. Yeah. And they needed her radicalism
to get across the line. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sad.
So I asked her what, so the next thing that Alice Paul works on is she sees that, okay, now women have the constitutional right to vote, but they don't have any other protections under the Constitution. And so she sets her sights on the Equal Rights Amendment, and she writes the language for the Equal Rights Amendment. But in my mind, my understanding of history, I don't think Equal Rights Amendment 1920. I think Equal Rights Amendment like 1970.
Yeah, I guess that's where my mind goes too.
So that's 50 years of time when this amendment has been drafted. So Alice Paul, in my brain, her history ends with the 19th Amendment, but that's actually just the beginning of her advocacy.
Right, yeah.
So I asked her why she thought this legislation after this is lesser known and what she's doing after the 19th Amendment.
I know, she doesn't just walk off into the sunset. She has to be continuing her legend.
Right. So this is what she said.
Well, I think that there were a lot of other important things that were happening in the world. We had the Great Depression, we had the Second World War. I think then we had the Cold War. So those are some big generational things that went on. It doesn't mean that the ERA, I think, was lost during that time. What is really fascinating, I always sort of like to think about the positive elements of history. What kept it alive for so long, right? I mean, it wasn't magic. It was hard work. It was constant organizing. And the fact that Alice Paul was able to keep it alive and then it was able to pass Congress and go out to the states for ratification before falling just a few states shy is remarkable. I mean, passing a constitutional amendment is not easy, right? And then to think it comes back again from the dead just in the last few years with even more states, the last few needed for ratification. It's kind of like the amendment that won't die. And I think that there's a reason for that. It's because people can recognize that the word woman or women is nowhere in the U.S. Constitution. Women were literally not written into the Constitution of America. And it's bizarre. And people don't even realize it. And those who may, good on them. But if there have been polls taken as well recently that show that like 90% of Americans think that the ERA is part of our Constitution already. So that's another misperception that's out there. Seems so obvious. It must have passed, but it hasn't.
So it kind of makes sense, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of things going on in this time period post 19th Amendment.
Yep.
And it makes sense that this would not be the primary focus.
It totally makes sense. Is it right? Not so sure, but
well, it's weird that you would think the momentum they had in World War I, where they didn't give up, they didn't stop advocating, but it almost seemed like they got this victory, so they could kind of put women away for a little while.
they were like, all right, we gave them something. Like, let's go do something else now.
yeah.
But
And not that World War II is like, not worth a worthy cause.
I mean, what is that time? No, just kidding. I mean, yeah, World War II, pretty big issue. I guess we can put liberties aside. But I get the irony of it. Like, you're going off to fight for democracy in another country. Mm-hmm. And you don't really have it at home.
Yeah, you have the right to vote at home, but you don't have equal protections
Under the law.
at home. And lots of random policies that it's going to take many women for the next...
I mean, at this point in time, you can't own a mortgage. You can't buy a home by yourself.
Yeah.
You can't sign a lease on a car.
Can't get a credit card without your husband.
No, you have to have a man to do any of that.
Right.
And hopefully a married man, because that makes more sense to the government.
Right.
So, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
You come so far, like, you can vote. Good. Now you can start changing at least the people in office who make those policies, but the policies still haven't changed very far.
Yeah.
And now you're being asked to take on jobs and careers that men typically held while they're away.
Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Great, thanks for that.
But I can't plan for retirement or own my own home.
Right. And if you don't come home, like, I'm still screwed over here.
Yeah, still got to move back with my mom. And, oh gosh, if she doesn't have a dad,
Yeah.
still screwed. Better go find a male neighbor to take you in.
So for Alice Paul, her getting written out of history is sort of a combination of she doesn't want to be.
Right.
She's intentionally written out by the people who didn't like her radical approach to things.
Well, it's like kind of distancing yourself from someone who doesn't have the same methodology as you. It's like, no, she's crazy, but we're normal.
Right.
It's like, girl, she got you here. Give her a high five and put her in the picture.
Right, exactly. So I think this is a really good place to take a break, and
Great.
we'll be right back. For lesson plan ideas and how to teach women's history, go to our website, www.remedialherstory.com. You can also follow us on Instagram or Facebook. If you think what we're doing is needed, please consider joining our Patreon community. Through Patreon, you can sponsor a podcast with a small donation. Patrons get access to behind-the-scenes information, gear, and bonus episodes. Patreon allows you, the listener, to ensure that the shows you love continue. This episode is sponsored by our patrons: Kent and Jamie Heckel from Ohio, Leah Tanger from Connecticut, Sarah Reardon from New Hampshire, Barbara Tisler from New York, Mark Breyer from wherever his van has wandered, Jeffrey Ecker and Brooke Neva Sullivan from right here next to me. Thank you so much for your contributions to this podcast. You make it possible. All right, welcome back.
Whoop, whoop. Okay, so we've learned all these things about her. Why is she not someone we've learned about?
Yeah, so I think if you have a teacher who teaches women's history, she's learned about in the context of the 19th Amendment and then kind of dropped.
Okay.
I think that she is not taught after that. And it's really funny because she's still a very young woman with a long career ahead of her.
How old is she at this point?
Oh, I don't know, but let's see. I think she gets her doctorates in the, I'm making this up, but I'm going to guess like the mid-10s, something like that.
Okay, I'm putting her like mid-30s.
Yeah, or 20s. So
still.
she's young.
Okay.
She's young. So I'm those dates are fudged a little bit, but maybe 20s or 30s. So she's really young.
That's impressive.
She's got lots of years of life ahead of her.
No, don't you know you die at 30?
Oh.
Isn't that a thing still?
That's still a thing.
No, J-Lo exists. So does Shakira.
So does Shakira. Shakira.
Aren't they like 65?
They're amazing.
I know.
So That's what I asked Tina Cassidy, though. So I think it's
good.
a really
Okay.
great question. So I asked her if there was one thing that you wished every school child knew about Alice Paul, what would it be? And this is what she said.
Well, there are the basics that everyone should know about her, which is that she was the mastermind behind this idea of needing a constitutional amendment guaranteeing the vote for women. There were other suffrage organizations out there that were trying to get voting rights for women at the state level, but Alice Paul knew that there were many states in America that would never grant the vote to women. Most of them were in the South. In more recent years has been a lot of conversation about racism in the suffrage movement, and that certainly was a thing. Racism is still a thing. And I think anywhere where, where racism is, it needs to be eradicated. Alice Paul definitely recognized that a federal amendment would be necessary to combat the racist roots for the anti-suffrage movement in the South. That doesn't mean that, I should add, Alice Paul also did and said some things that were racist, right? And so I think it's important as we study historical figures to know that people are complex. They can possess good qualities and bad qualities, and we can judge them on the whole of their character. And we can sit and learn so much about ourselves and our history by understanding the layers that people bring to a cause or a movement. And I do think it's worth considering all aspects of who Alice Paul was. The third thing, of course, is that she did also draft the Equal Rights Amendment, and that amendment is still alive and awaiting final ratification, and that could come soon. I think a fourth thing to know about her is that her political views around equality were also shaped by her religious views as a Quaker, which is really interesting. There were, many Quakers were among the early abolitionists as well, and many were also in the suffrage movement. And so the idea that equality could be at the center of a religion, I think is really important even today. It's still a relevant idea. So those are the big ones. I will tell you one of the most common questions I get about Alice Paul is whether she was married or was ever in a relationship. I certainly appreciate the question, even though I don't really think it's relevant, but I'll provide the answer because so many people ask. No, the answer is she was never married or in a relationship. I think her, there's no concrete evidence as to her sexual orientation or her gender identity. She really was dedicated to suffrage and to the cause of equal rights for women her whole life.
They do a good job in the film showing that the one that we referenced before. But it's so funny because even that film could not help but give a love interest. And it cracks me up that you do get that question a lot. And
yeah. And, there are so many people who say, well, of course, Alice Paul was probably a lesbian. And I mean, she very well may have been. There were plenty of, lesbians who were incredibly important to the suffrage movement. I think it's important to acknowledge that lesbians who did not marry men were at increased sort of risk for instability in many economic aspects of their lives. Like women weren't allowed to own property. They couldn't open a bank account without a man signing. Like there were so many misogynistic aspects of life then. I mean, even up until the 1970s, women couldn't have a bank account on their own or a credit card, right? So if you think about, what it was like then to live as a lesbian, it would have been even harder. So there would have been even greater motivation for them to want equal rights. But even still, there are plenty of cis women who recognized the problems of the inequality in the system. And so, it really required all kinds of women, as it does today, to make change.
So there's a lot in what she just said.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, there's people in history that have done some things that you want to turn away from and not teach because they're really hard. They're hard to listen to, they're hard to learn, but doesn't mean that you shouldn't teach on those topics and say these are wrong things and these are the reasons that they probably used that as their foundation of education.
Yeah.
And
it's
obviously
hard to
her
know if her Tina Cassidy talked about Ida B. Wells being pushed to the back of the parade, and Ida B. Wells obviously being a badass and being like,
gets right up
not
in there.
gonna do that things, which I love, but that's not, like you're saying, like it's hard to know if she was being a pragmatic politician and knowing that she has to get these Southern white women to march in this parade too, or
I think it's very generous of you.
Or is that her? I mean, that it's still low. It doesn't change that it's low key racist, like it's racism. So how do you
let's face
put
it,
her
though,
in
like,
her time and you just say she was not ahead of her time, and that's sad. But she was in her time.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what you say. Is you give the context and you let students determine that too. It's like this person they lived in this time period, and these behaviors in that time period were pretty prevalent.
Yeah, I mean, Woodrow Wilson during that same era,
like
resegregated DC. It had already been desegregated, and he resegregated.
Sounds like a great guy.
So weird.
But yeah, I mean, that's exactly the things that you're going to run into is like people lived those time periods. They were not woke. They are not in 2020. No. They're not reading things.
2020 showed
I know. But at least
anymore.
Oh yeah, turns out 2020 cured racism. No, but like they're not self-educating on discrimination, and they have no awareness of their behavior at that time period. So you have to tell students that, and then you have to say, this is where we're at, and this is where she's at. We're not excusing her behavior.
Right.
We're recognizing it.
Right.
But she also doesn't deplete some of her actions.
Saw this resurgence of white supremacist movements. There was a KKK march on Washington, which is just horrifying, by the way.
But when you think about it,
like seeing these people in their cloaks marching through DC.
Horrifying. I mean, last week, I think all those people learned why their family members used to wear hats now that they're all arrested. But, no, I think when you think about, those are the children, 1920s, those are the children of former slave owners.
Right.
They're now grown up. They're now adults.
Well, and so some of those black women came to her and said, listen, we need you.
Not cool.
You want voting rights for women. You know what would make the biggest difference in the lives of black women in the South and even in the North? You know what would make a big difference is if we didn't have all these black codes, if we didn't have all these,
Jim Crow law,
poll taxes and things like that, if we didn't have all these things, and Alice Paul says, well, that's not really like a suffrage issue, that's a racism issue, and so she doesn't get into that issue.
Yeah, she basically is like, that's a you problem, not a me problem.
Right.
And it's like, turns out we all have vaginas, so can we play on the same fucking softball team? That'd be cool. Anyways.
Yeah, so, but Tina gets into, I pressed on this a little bit, and so she gets into that. She talks about, the current resurgence trying to throw Alice Paul under the bus, and it's hard because I love Alice Paul, and I think a lot of people who've studied women's history look at her as this like icon of badassery, and at the same time, this piece of her legacy is really hard to grapple with.
Nobody's perfect, but at the same time, racism?
Right, or rather, I mean, the way, and maybe this is me, like, not, I just see her as being pragmatic in her time, and maybe that's me cloaking racism. I don't know.
It's a little bit, but it's I get where you're going. I get what you're saying. I understand it. In the same time, it's like we have to validate she said those things and they're out in the universe.
Yeah.
And it's how she felt.
March in the back.
And it didn't help women of color.
No.
So that's where...
That's point blank. It
it's like it didn't help women of color. So, not super cool of Alice Paul.
Wouldn't put her on the list of anti-racists.
No, but also not someone who saw women as equal either. She categorized people. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. So,
but I do get her work is impressive, and she did make huge impacts for, well, let's say white women.
Yeah. So I asked Tina Cassidy to weigh in on this, and this is what she said.
I will say one other thing about Alice Paul that I think has been insightful for me personally, and that is how incredibly strategic and also creative she was. Certainly she had this awesome energy that propelled her entire life, and I think that really only comes from a place of passion where you just believe so deeply in it, that you need to right this injustice that carried her through. But the creativity that she brought to the cause was just tremendous. And I think that there are so many lessons for those involved in protest movements today. All the different ways she thought about creating different kinds of photo ops or getting press attention or engaging regular people in the heartland, whether it was to subscribe to her newspaper that she created both as a propaganda organ and as a fundraising mechanism. The idea of, women driving cars cross country with scrolls of signatures in favor of the 19th Amendment at a time when women didn't even drive cars, let alone before there was an interstate highway system. Dropping a banner in the House chamber during a presidential speech, putting a woman on a white horse at the front of a protest march, which had never happened before in American history. Like so many things, it was constant. So I guess I just want to tip my hat to the creativity and the stamina and the strategy. It was really all of it quite brilliant and inspiring, and lots of great ideas even for people today.
It's interesting. I read recently that Alice Paul died in poverty and had asked for money from, was it the NWP, to support her in her old age or something like that?
Well, she was so poor that by the time she was in a nursing home in New Jersey, they had to pass a hat to buy clothes for her. I mean, this woman never had any job besides being an organizer, and all of that required reliance on donations from regular people, and so it's really sad to think that she died in that way, sort of unrecognized and alone. I think it says a lot about how much we have not appreciated our women heroes in American history. And also, again, speaks to her own humility, where she was good about asking for money for her cause, but not so much money for herself to live on.
Yeah. Wow. She's just so cool.
Yeah.
I wish I could be a better human.
Yes. I know. She was really cool. And there were also, I do have to give a shout out for some other suffragists too, like Ida B. Wells, who, was an African-American woman who, marched in that same parade with Alice Paul in 1913, even though there were many white suffragists who did not think that march should be integrated. She was a woman who was a sort of a pioneering journalist who crusaded against lynching. And, it was hard enough to be a suffragist, a white suffragist, willing to march in the streets and be called a radical for doing so, but to be a Black woman willing to put your body on the line like that in the same way, in a much more controversial way, at a time when racism was so much more overt than it is today, is just tremendous. So I think that it's also worth just thinking about, what it meant for Black women then. and women of other ethnicities.
Yeah, who don't get their vote for many years after that.
Well, so I think can we talk about that for a minute? Because that is so important. I want to be really explicit in that the 19th Amendment granted voting rights to women. It did not explicitly say voting rights for white women. It did not explicitly exclude any other women. It just gave voting rights to women. And what happened was that states and local governments, after the 19th Amendment passed, imposed disenfranchisement in certain ways. So maybe they imposed a literacy test or a poll tax, or they gerrymandered a district so that it made more difficult for African American votes to count. Those are all the ways that Black women and other Native peoples were disenfranchised. I should also note, speaking of Native Americans, the 19th Amendment did not affect Native Americans. They weren't considered citizens. So they didn't get the vote until much later, because what the 19th Amendment says is that, women who are citizens can vote. So Native women weren't included. Native men could not vote, by the way. Chinese Americans couldn't vote because of this thing called the Chinese Exclusion Act. And, I think it is important to just say that America has had a history of coming up with ways to not allow certain groups of people to vote. So, Alice Paul's intent with the 19th Amendment was to open that up for as many women as possible. But there were all of these other things at play that nipped away at that progress over time. And even by 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed, it was meant to address many of those moves that had disenfranchised people since the 19th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment, which, by the way, gave Black men the vote after the Civil War. And they were also disenfranchised after that federal amendment passed. So, you do have to think about what the states are up to and why they were trying to, take power away from their voters. So even though the Voting Rights Act of 1965 sought to correct all of these injustices, there's still voter suppression today. There's still ways that local governments try to disenfranchise voters. We even saw it in the last election. And it's just something that we have to be constantly vigilant about. So, I do think we have to give the 19th Amendment its due for what it attempted to offer American women citizens, and put the blame for disenfranchisement where it really belongs.
I think also the tricky part about talking about Alice Paul in a classroom setting is figuring out, the 19th Amendment has a clear space because it's such a national...
It's a pivotal point.
Thing. How do you talk about Alice Paul's contributions to the ERA post that point? Because the big names in the ERA are not, other than her writing it, she's not the big name in that. You think Betty Friedan, you think Gloria Steinem, right? These women in the generations to follow. Alice Paul actually dies pretty much in poverty. She doesn't have money. She actually goes to Now, and which is the organization she founded, and asks them to support her financially while she's and they won't support her, which is just super weird. So there's this kind of she just disappears in the story, and it also the poverty thing speaks a little bit to wealth. She doesn't marry, so
there's no dudes around to pick her up.
Most of her life was in fundraising and all those things.
Well, and there's also a huge shift back then in nonprofit world, is that nonprofits felt like all the funds that came in had to go to the cause. Nonprofits has since learned that you have an operational budget that you have to allot for, and you can pay staff.
Yeah.
That was a big change in the 1930s. So and that was really, really new to the nonprofit world. And so, like, that's hard. And it's probably hard for them to see how they can give her funding and give her a paycheck when they don't have an operational budget and all the monies go to the cause.
Right. And she put all the monies to the cause.
It's not uncommon. There's actually a whole, there's some really cool articles out there, which I can send to you, but like about nonprofit directors actually living in poverty because they give everything to the cause and they don't take a paycheck. And they can't for several years. So it's a huge thing that thankfully nonprofits have fixed.
Well, so I asked Tina Cassidy what she thought about where Alice Paul should go. Like, where do you talk about these later parts of her story? And she actually brought it back to the 19th Amendment again, which is interesting. So this is what she said.
I mean, I think telling the story of the fight for the 19th Amendment is crucial, so that can back you up all the way to 1913. And what's really interesting is the interplay between the suffrage movement and the start and end of the First World War. So those two things overlapped, and I do think that the U.S. involvement in the First World War escalated the acceptance of this idea for the 19th Amendment, because Americans were fighting for democracy abroad and yet didn't have it at home. How could we in America say that we're a beacon of democracy and trying to show, Europe, Russia, Germany, all of these countries what true democracy was when we had disenfranchised half the population or had never enfranchised half the population, right? So, people really noticed the hypocrisy of that. Suffragists also used it as part of their campaign against the Wilson administration. Woodrow Wilson was the president then. He was against suffrage. He was for the war. And, I just think that you can't really understand American democracy for the rest of the 20th century without understanding that moment. So.
And, I mean, amazing life.
Yeah. She's an amazing woman.
So do we have a lesson plan on this one?
Yeah. So at this point, we have started to we have a lot of lesson plans now on women's suffrage and the Equal Rights Amendment.
Okay.
And so I see this particular topic as the bridge between suffrage and ERA.
Okay.
And obviously there's a lot of things in there like World War II and Rosie the Riveter and women getting involved in the war effort and all of that as well. But we have an inquiry on our website right now that asks, why did Woodrow Wilson change his mind? And there are documents that students read where they realize that Alice Paul is protesting and kind of a thorn in his side. And they're drawn to conclude basically that it's because of her that he changes his mind on this issue.
Okay.
And
that's pretty awesome.
So that inquiry, though, I think is supplemented really well with the next inquiry that we have, which is her writing of the ERA and what she does afterwards.
Awesome.
So we're sort of setting up we're working towards, with all of these lesson plans we're cranking out, this continuous narrative from the beginning to end of U.S. history about women's story.
Yeah.
And we're actually, because suffrage is such a huge topic, we're starting to link all those up together.
Well, and they span huge decades in America, which is really cool that you can paint the narrative from that lens.
Yeah, it's getting really exciting to see it all kind of piecing together. You might know a topic in women's history and then realizing that it's interconnected with...
Yes, it's like, and then this to this, and this to this, and then, that must be nice.
It's getting there.
Awesome. Thanks, Kelsey.
Brooke, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, I'm Brooke Sullivan.
I'm Kelsey Eckert.
See you next time.
Woo!
Thanks so much for listening to Remedial Herstory, the other 50%. Please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts to bring more voices to the conversation. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time.